What's up, guys? Welcome to Santa Cruz Medicinals Radio. This week's episode is on red meat. It's something I have to cover because I eat a lot of red meat. I eat red meat pretty much every day. Most days of the week, I'm eating some red meat, and I get a lot of people hitting me up going, hey, I've heard red meat causes cancer. I've heard it gives us colon cancer. I've heard that it clogs our arteries. And they want to know what I think about this, what the data actually says on this, and how this myth, which you'll learn it is a myth, came to be. There's also a lot of younger kids hit me up saying, my dad won't let us eat red meat because he says it clogs our arteries, or that's what his doctor says. So we're going to look into that. Before we get into that, our podcast does have a sponsor, and the sponsor is ourselves. So before every episode, I take some of our Santa Cruz Medicinals nootropic capsules. Really good formula right there. And it's also brought to you by Santa Cruz Paleo, which is on Amazon. Type in Santa Cruz Paleo if you want to check out some of those formulas. We use the highest quality ingredients possible in all of our formulas. We just launched our electrolytes with magnesium glycinate. Go try those out. Really good stuff. So, red meat. As you know, if you know me, I eat a lot of red meat. And recently, that has become very controversial with people saying that it causes cancer, heart disease, colon cancer, acidity in the body. People say that red meat isn't digestible. All these are complete myths, and we'll get into why that is. So in this episode, we're going to look at a brief history on red meat in our diets as early human beings and some of the claims against red meat. By 2.6 million years ago, and I really want you to think about how long ago that is. 2.6 million years ago, there was an expansion in our diet, which anthropologists believe that early hominins began incorporating meat and marrow from small to very large animals in their diet. So there's a lot of evidence for meat and marrow consumption in early human beings. And obviously we weren't Homo sapien yet at this time, but we sort of looked like a human being, somewhat. So we find butchery marks on bones. We find evidence of slicing bone, basically butchery from stone tools. There's a lot of evidence of this. So there's evidence of pounding bones with large stones to break them open to access the marrow. And these are called butchery marks in anthropology. And they could be from, skinning animals, getting to the marrow, and basically getting the meat out of the animal that they killed in order to eat. This is something that our ancestors did. Scientists began to recognize these butchery marks on early Stone Age fossil records, and then obviously we move into, years and years later, the earliest drawings ever, and I always talk about this, the earliest drawings ever that we know of, that human beings have ever done, the cave art, is of animals getting butchered, animals with spears in them. If meat wasn't very critical to our ancestors, why would the first cave art ever that we know of be of animals getting butchered? And there's tons of records for this. So we have the fossil evidence of at least 3 species of early hominids around 2.6 million years ago. It's kind of boring for some people, but this is the anthropology stuff that I like. Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus garhi, Paranthropus, Arthropyce, and then Homo habilis and Homo erectus. We start to see biological features of meat eating in our early ancestors. This has to do with tooth size, gut size, and an increase in brain and body size. We hear people say, another myth that I hear people say is, our ancestors didn't eat red meat. They were mostly plant-based. That is not very true. What is true is that meat was harder to come by. They had to hunt and actually go get these animals and then butcher them. It was it's difficult. Some tribes appear to have gotten very good at it and very proficient. Way later in human history, we see Native Americans that almost had an abundance of red meat. Too much. So to say our ancestors are plant-based is very strange. We are omnivores, and that is what our jaw and our gut resembles. We don't have like a ruminant animal gut where we can digest tons of plant matter, and we don't have a fully carnivorous gut where it's really high acidity and very sharp teeth. But to say that we can't digest meat or we ate plant-based as our ancestors, we just did not. So let's look into what is in red meat and why might human beings crave it so much. So we're going to talk about beef for right now, just to keep it simple. The protein content of lean cooked beef is around 26 to 27%. Animal protein is usually Very high quality for the human body. It contains all 9 essential amino acids that were required for growth and maintenance of your body. Those are the building blocks of protein, and so they're very important. I don't think anybody's disputing that good high quality protein is not good for the human body, but what the mainstream narrative is that red meat is bad for you and it's going to clog your arteries and give you cancer if you eat too much of it. So let's look into that. Meat is obviously one of the most complete dietary sources of protein, and red meat also has tons of nutrition. A small portion of red meat is going to contain a good amount of heme iron, which is the body's bioavailable form of iron. When you eat iron from plants, it's very difficult to absorb. You want to get heme iron from red meat. It obviously has a lot of zinc, B vitamins, bioavailable B vitamins, and yeah, it's just packed with minerals, nutrients, and enzymes, all this type of stuff that we want. And red meat is also a really good source of antioxidants. You don't hear about that too much. When people say, I'm eating a really antioxidant-rich diet, you typically wouldn't think of them eating a steak or beef liver or anything like that. You would think blueberries and stuff, which I love blueberries. I just ate some. But meat does have antioxidants such as carnosine, anserine, lipoic acid, glutathione. So there are tons of antioxidants in meat, and obviously those help prevent against cellular damage. There's also a lot of healthy fats in meat, which our ancestors absolutely craved, and you, as a human being listening to this today, you crave healthy fats. Meat is rich in saturated fat, and a large portion of those saturated fats in meat are stearic acid, which are known, funny enough, to have no effect on cholesterol levels, yet we'll get into the whole cholesterol debate. And the other 50% of the fatty acids in red meat are mostly monounsaturated fats, and there are a small amount of polyunsaturated fats in red meat, both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So let's get into some of the main criticisms of red meat. One of the things that I briefly covered, and I'll just dispel this myth right now, is that we're not designed to eat red meat and that we've mostly been plant-based and this is the way that we should be. I think most anthropologists would just laugh at this because there's so much evidence of meat eating. It's insane. Human beings also produce several pancreatic enzymes that are specifically there to digest fats and proteins from meat, essentially. You could argue that they're there to digest everything, but when you look at the composition of them, they're very well designed to digest meat. These enzymes include pepsin, trypsin, and a bunch of others, lipase. So another really telling indicator is human bile, which contains salt, such as bilirubin, biliverdin, which break down and emulsify animal fats extremely well. So to say that we just can't digest meat is wrong. We can, and we do well. So I do think a lot of people in today's society, especially when they're switching from a vegan diet or they've done some radical diet change, your body will adapt to that. And so if you are switching from one diet to another, your body might have to catch up in producing those enzymes that it was designed to if you're eating maybe a low-fat diet. So that is something that you might want to look into. If you're trying to add more meat into your diet, maybe look into a good digestive enzyme. And yeah, so animals that only eat greens and grasses are called ruminant animals. The bile in their stomach is completely different than a human being. So yeah, I think we can move on from that. Human beings are omnivores. We can eat anything. I don't eat a lot of grains. We can eat grains. We can digest grains. We can digest Dr. Pepper soda. I think it's very difficult for the body to digest, and it has issues, but we can digest a lot of stuff, so yeah. One of the main claims, red meat causes heart disease and clogs your arteries. Everybody has heard this. If you go to many doctors today, which have very little nutritional background, they will say, oh, if you eat red meat, you're going to get heart disease. It'll clog your arteries. So let's look into that. This has been really pushed by the mainstream media, even though there's no consistent evidence that saturated fat found in red meat raises your blood cholesterol levels. And what's even more convincing than that is there's a large study involving 350,000 participants, and they found no association between saturated fat intake and coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. In one of the other largest studies, there were 60,000 Japanese women, and it was shown to have an inverse association between saturated fat consumption and stroke. So that means the more saturated fat that those Japanese women ate, the lower their risk of stroke. So There's much more to the cholesterol story than LDL being bad and cholesterol being bad. So if you are eliminating red meat from your diet in hopes that you're not going to get heart disease, the evidence isn't there, and it also doesn't make any sense when you look at the history of human beings. Why would we be designed to crave something? And our brain is made up of 60% fat. Our hormones, cholesterol is required for hormone transportation. Why would we crave this so deeply, yet it's killing us? It doesn't work like that. So how did these claims get started? I've talked about Ansel Keys and his research and the funding of the American Heart Association by Procter & Gamble, which made the first seed oils out there. And one of the big studies that made the waves in the media was red and processed meat linked to an increase in heart disease, an Oxford study. So that title was just everywhere. New York Times picked it up. Everywhere picked it up that, oh my God, an increase in red meat and processed meat led to an increase in heart disease. How was that study done? So this was called a large review of data. This wasn't a study where they got people, they fed them red meat, they controlled variables, and then they found that the risk of heart disease went up. That is not how that study was done. How this study went was they surveyed a bunch of people. They said, do you eat red meat? And this was done in Europe, in modern day Europe. And the people would go, yeah, I eat red meat. That could mean anything. That could mean they eat McDonald's. That could mean they, are extremely unhealthy and they smoke cigarettes while they eat their steak. They could be a seed oil consumer. They could be somebody who doesn't exercise. They could be somebody who's fat and depressed and lazy, but they eat red meat sometimes. And we have a huge issue with these type of studies in America, in the United States, anywhere in the modern world because of healthy user bias. We are told over the last 30, 40, 50 years that red meat is bad. And if you eat it, you're doing something risky for your health. So what happens when people are red meat eaters? They oftentimes don't exercise. They might engage in cigarette smoking, alcohol. They might be more unhealthy. Whereas today, a vegan and vegetarian diet is known as being healthy. So that group of people that abstain from eating meat might engage more in practices like exercise, not smoking, drinking less alcohol. So in this study, they surveyed those people and they saw a slight increase in cancer in the group that said that they eat red meat. This is purely correlation, not causation, and it's just a horrible study. What I think is going on, you'll see this as a theme, is that these studies get picked up by our media outlets, and some of the studies that show a benefit to eating red meat, it's just not a fancy headline. It doesn't get people worried about an activity that they engage in, and it doesn't trigger that fear response, so it's not going to get picked up by the media. And there's also a big narrative to push people towards plant-based. So the next big claim is that red meat is a carcinogen, and it's classified as a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. So for decades, we're told, don't eat it because of saturated fat. And that argument now is becoming less convincing. Even Harvard Health is coming out and saying we might not want to worry so much about dietary cholesterol. So now we're being told to not eat red meat by the World Health Organization because they marked it as a carcinogen. So the association between red meat and cancer is not strong at all. And if red meat really did cause cancer, you'd expect to see a linear, continuous increase in cancer rates as red meat consumption increased. But that is not what we see time after time. In so many different studies, we do not see a linear increase. In some studies that we'll get into, there's actually a decrease in cancer rates among the people who eat the most red meat. What do I think about the World Health Organization classifying it as a carcinogen? I do not care about their opinions on red meat, frankly. And they are just using some of these studies that are very flawed and saying that it causes an increase in cancer. Another big claim is colon cancer. So we've sort of gotten into some of the background on how these studies say that red meat increases cancer, but let's look into colon cancer specifically. Dr. Paul Saladino just did a whole 60-minute episode on colon cancer and red meat. If you want to really get in deep there, I suggest you listen to that. But this is a very common narrative, and there's a lot of mainstream news articles that say red meat causes colon cancer. And I think a lot of people cling on to this because when you eat red meat, the consistency of it, it's difficult to chew sometimes. It's just very rich, because it's very rich in nutrients. And I think a lot of people have a very simplified view of nutrition where they are easily convinced that, wow, I'm eating that. I could see that clogging my colon or clogging my arteries, the fat could clog it. That is not how the human body works, and I think that is why those titles get a lot of traction. And we saw over the last couple of years a bunch of titles and news articles saying an increase in red meat consumption increases colon cancer risk. Now, this is based, again, on very bad research where they're surveying a bunch of unhealthy people, and the people who eat red meat have a slight increase in colon cancer compared to the people who are vegans and vegetarians. Again, I think that's very population-based because we also see in countries like Asia, there's a bunch of studies from Asia where red meat does not have the same stigma as America and Europe. In Asia and in many places, in China and Japan, when you eat red meat, you're actually considered higher status, where that is flipped in the United States over the last 60, 70 years. Not eating red meat is associated with, being healthy, the LA vegan, lifestyle. So Asia sort of has this opposite view on red meat. And we see this study from Asian countries. It's titled Meat Intake and Cause-Specific Mortality, a pooled analysis of Asian prospective cohort studies. What they found there is that there is no association between intake of total red meat. And in this study, they looked at red meat, they looked at poultry, they looked at fish, and there's no association at all between the intake of red meat and the risks of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, or colon cancer among men and women. This study looked at 300,000 people, and it literally found that red meat consumption led to better health. More red meat consumption was associated with a lower rate of cancer. So what's going on there? Do Asian people just react completely differently to red meat? I don't think that's what's going on. I think in the United States, we have a clear bias against red meat and a big narrative being pushed there, and they're interpreting data in different ways, and we see the exact opposite in this study in Asia. So is it possible that red meat, which is viewed as healthier in Asia, and it's actually a symbol of status, so maybe those people are, it's a slightly healthier population, does that come into play? I think so. Another study in 2007 that didn't get popularized at all, and it's not surprising, I just don't think stuff like this gets shared that much. The study is titled, Eating Red Meat Will Not Increase Colorectal Cancer Risk, study suggests. And it goes into it. Recent studies published in the Journal of Cancer and Science have disproved the common myth that consumption of red meat increases colorectal cancer risk. So these studies out there just don't get popularized by our media. We have a clear study right there saying that red meat does not increase colorectal cancer risk, yet nobody really talks about that. The other thing I'm going to cover right now with meat is that cooking meat releases heterocyclic amines, also known as HCAs, which give you cancer. So this is really interesting to me, and it's something I was sort of concerned about when reading about it, because there does appear to be some data on this, that charred meat can lead to heterocyclic amine formation, and those are connected with cancer. So I like to cook my meat, and I was a little concerned about this, so I looked in depth into this because I thought, well, if there's a different way that I can cook the meat, then I will do that. It doesn't make much sense to me that, fire and meat would lead to cancer. Again, millions of years and then hundreds of thousands of years as Homo sapien, we were preparing meat in these ways, so it's kind of strange that that would suddenly be killing us. So there is a study that Dr. Paul Saladino referenced on his Twitter and that I read into, and they concluded that the amount of cooked meats that were extremely browned showed an increase in colorectal cancer. The amount in meats that were lightly fried, boiled, and even grilled showed no consistent association with any form of cancer. And when you look into the details in this study, in the way that you're probably cooking meat, you shouldn't worry at all. There is some evidence that heavily charred meat, and you're talking like really cooked through meat, I've never cooked a steak in the way that at the temperatures that they were showing and the times that they were showing in that study. That's what led to that heterocyclic amine formation. So this is something to look into. If you're like charring every steak, and it was more about the well-doneness of the steak, not so much the temperature on the outside. So sort of interesting. I think my takeaway there is to not significantly overcook your meat. But even standard grilling, some pretty high heat cooking in the study, totally fine. And I wouldn't worry too much if you occasionally eat some crispy steak or you kind of fry up some meat or chicken, whatever it is. I wouldn't worry about that. What we see here is the highest concentration of heterocyclic amines are found in very well done cooked meats or in meats that are heavily charred by flame broiling. So another challenge to this grilled meat causes cancer narrative is there really isn't too much real-world evidence linking the consumption of well-done meat to cancer. It's very inconsistent. It's interesting to me to look at. I try to not heavily char my meat anymore because I do think there's something to that. Another really interesting study is, you can look this up, there's a paper titled Marinades Reduce Heterocyclic Amines from Primitive Food Preparation Techniques. This is where they marinated meat, different marinades, salt, olive oil, and what they concluded was the polyphenols from these marinades, the antioxidant effect of those marinades, protected against primitive food preparation techniques, meaning like just cooking right over a flame, stuff like that. So if you're worried about that, and you might want to throw a marinade on your meat, and that can protect against some of those HCAs. Those are sort of some of the main criticisms of meat. I think the heterocyclic amine one is interesting, and what I've learned from there is I use my Traeger, I use my cast iron, I do still grill. Right now I'm making a beef stew in the oven. That's not going to produce those HCAs that you should worry about at all. So I don't go overboard on the crust of the steak. I think the jury's still out on that one. But what we can clearly see from the other 2 points of red meat clogs your arteries and red meat gives you cancer, there is not evidence to support that, and you will still see a lot of studies pushed over the next decade, 20 years, whatever it is, that say that red meat causes cancer and it clogs your arteries. You're still going to see that. What you won't see is the studies showing the exact opposite. And these are big studies, and they're out there. And we also know that red meat is extremely nutrient dense. It's a very good food for people with autoimmune issues, as it doesn't trigger a lot of food allergies and gut issues that a lot of people have. And our ancestors have eaten red meat and sought after it forever. So to say that it suddenly kills you, I think we should point the sword towards other things: excess sugar consumption, grains, pesticides, artificial flavorings, lack of exercise, sunlight, mineral deficiencies. But yet we somehow continue to point the sword at red meat and tell people to eat soy protein instead, and, eat cereal to start your day, but don't eat red meat because that's going to hurt you. It's sort of crazy to me. So in conclusion, red meat is extremely nutrient dense, and I think it's one of the best foods ever, especially for anybody dealing with autoimmune issues, gut issues. It's an amazing source of protein and minerals, and it's something our bodies crave. If you're listening to this and you eat red meat, you know what I'm talking about. When you make that grass-fed steak and you're slicing into it, there's something primal that just ignites in your body, and it's probably because for millions of years, as a species, we have craved red meat, and it's extremely nutrient dense, and it's kept us alive in many situations. So I do not think red meat causes cancer. I'm not worried about its effects on my cholesterol or clogging my arteries because I'm extremely healthy. So I don't think red meat is going to kill me. I eat a lot of red meat. I eat red meat almost every day, and I feel amazing. How is it that a food that our ancestors have sought after and prepared forever is suddenly bad for us? I think that the research is bad, and we're studying a bunch of unhealthy people, and it's leading towards bad conclusions. There's also an agenda being pushed, and there's a lot of money in convincing people to switch from red meat to soy protein or pea protein. And we've seen the push. Beyond Burger, all these plant-based meats. We see Kim Kardashian now endorsing these. They want people to buy their products. And a really good marketing tactic is saying the alternative, which is a real burger, is killing you. So you need to buy our burger filled with soy protein, seed oils, sugar, wheat, whatever those things are made of. But I just think that's insane, and you really need to follow the money there. Unfortunately, in America, it's really not hard to sway a narrative and get stuff published in the news. With a good chunk of money, you can definitely do that. And I think what's going on is a lot of these companies fund research with the intent to show that red meat is bad, which wouldn't be difficult to do. You could go survey a bunch of unhealthy people coming out of McDonald's. Do you eat red meat? Yes. Cool. And then survey a bunch of people coming out of a vegetarian, restaurant in Malibu. Maybe they just surf, they got some sun, they're vegetarian. Do you eat meat? No. Okay, let's compare those two groups and say the group that ate red meat from the McDonald's, they're unhealthy, and the group that ate vegetarian is healthy. So red meat bad, vegetarian good. It's ridiculous. The point is, for anybody listening to this, eat your red meat and enjoy it. Do not worry about it clogging your arteries. It's not going to give you colon cancer. You should try to eat very healthy. and live healthy. And I think red meat is a part of that. So enjoy your beef, choose grass-fed when you can, and yeah, make a steak, tag me in it, and share this episode with anybody that thinks that red meat is bad for them, or they're trying to limit their red meat intake because they think that it might kill them in some way. So we've made a mistake as a society in the last, 60 years saying that red meat is bad, and hopefully that narrative turns around. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. If you want to support us, go to scmedicinals.com, look at our products there, or type in Santa Cruz Paleo on Amazon. Check out our products there and get some of our supplements, get our electrolytes. Our protein is made with grass-fed, grass-finished beef. It's really amazing, really nutrient dense. I absolutely love the stuff. So yeah, that's it today. I'm going to go hit a workout. Got to go hit legs. So I'm going to get to it. Peace out. Later.